When I was a baby priest in my second assignment, I'd been in San Marino and I had very few funerals there, but I get to Venice near Santa Monica and I loaded with everything, including a lot of funerals. And so I had this relationship with this funeral home in Santa Monica. They were really, really cool people. And one of the funeral attendants was telling me a lot of the customs around the culture of death and the different cultures. And you learn a lot about cultures, but when you look at the way they deal with their dead and bury their dead, for example, there are some Asians who love to give honor and respect to those who have died and gone before them. So they would have the hearse with the coffin, then the family car, and either after them or before them, they'd have a family car for the grandparents of the deceased, who also were deceased now. And so there were no people in it, but it was for their spirits. And if they had great-grandparents who'd been a part of the life of this great-grandchild, they had a car for this person for their spirits. Now, you'd think, what a waste of money, an empty car. But they said, no, you have to honor those who have gone before. That's a very rich idea, I think, in a culture, to give honor and respect to those who have died. But there are other customs. For example, you go back in ancient history to the Egyptians. They built pyramids and put the bodies of their royalty there. But they put all these rich monies and jewels and things in with the coffin and with the body. And I think the idea was that when the person was raised up to whatever it was in the afterlife, they'd have riches to accompany them to take care of them in that life. It seems to me that was just setting it up for grave robbers because, you can't take it with you. At least that's what we say. They spoke of gypsies, some gypsies, who had the custom when the king of the gypsies would die, they would put all this money and the rings and jewels in with the body. Again, I suppose the same idea of the Egyptians. But really, you can't take it with you. Could you imagine this? When you die, getting a U-Haul truck to follow the hearse to take all your possessions and be buried with you? This is absurd. Worse is this, and I'm sorry, any cat lovers, please forgive me, but whenever I read that somebody dies and gives $2 million to their cat, I just want to die with them. I think, really? And then after the cat dies, what happens? Where does the money go? I suppose to the government. I don't know, but it just seems silly. The point is, you can't take it with you. You can't. When you die, you die. And the scriptures today make this point very vividly. The first reading, that famous reading from Wisdom says, vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity. Everything. Everything material is vanity because it rots away. It dies too. So if you put all your hope or all your belief or all your heart into things, possessions, ultimately you can't take them with you and you lose. Pushing that even further, the very opening line of the first verse of the responsorial psalm said, God turns men back to dust. Ain't that the truth? Two of my three brothers were cremated, and they'd been in the military, so I picked up their ashes and took them to the graveyard, the veterans near Bakersfield. And I remember picking them up and feeling this. I think I may have even said out loud, is this all it comes down to? A box of ashes? It is. Or if you bury the body, eventually that's what it turns into. I mean, we know it. God turns man back to dust. The second reading pushes the point in another way, and it's really the point of the scriptures today. This isn't scriptures about rich people. It's a scripture about greed. Truth is, poor people can be just as greedy as rich people. Not as likely, because if you're very rich, there's more to be greedy about. And money makes money. So many times the rich like to hold on to what they got and get more. But the poor can do that too. Anybody can be greedy. Anybody. And it says in the scripture today, localizing our sin as it finally gets realized in the material part of us. I think it all begins in the spirit. That's where I think sin begins, in a corrupt spirit, but it eventually ends up in the flesh or in the body or in the material. And greed is one of those things we can be greedy for time, but we're greedy for possessions, for things. And so it lists, after all of these sins of the body, it says the idolatry of greed, which lifts it up to another level, that greed becomes like a god to us. We worship the god of greed. And what happens to us when we do that, when we worship the god of greed, when possessions and things become everything to us? And this is the point of the gospel, and Jesus makes it very personal and very direct. He's standing there with a crowd of people, and this man shouts out, and it's funny how this happens in the scriptures. It happened last week with Martha. She kind of shouted out to Jesus, "Tell Mary to get up and help me with all this work." Remember? And Jesus says, "Martha, Martha, you're so preoccupied about things. Mary's chosen the better part. She's dealing with the Spirit. She's listening in spirit." And so today he's preaching, speaking to people, and a man shouts out in the crowd, "Tell my brother to give me my inheritance." Now, you may know this. The Jews passed on the inheritance to the oldest son. He's the only one who was guaranteed to get the money, everything from his father. And then his son got it. And then the first son of that one got it. It got passed down to the oldest son. If the son was generous, he might share it with the other brothers, but he didn't have to, and women couldn't inherit. Women couldn't inherit. So this brother, the older one, apparently he was greedy, going to keep it all, not give any to his brother, and his greedy brother wanted some of it. So he asked Jesus to intervene and fix it for him. Jesus, friend, I'm not your arbitrator. This isn't my business. But he used this opportunity, as he so often did, to teach the crowd. So he took that scene that took place, turns to the crowd and says, "Avoid greed in all its forms." I'm warning you, avoid greed in all its forms. And then he told the parable. Now, what I like about the parable, a lot of things, but one of it is the man speaks to himself. Now, I talk to myself like a crazy person. I do all the time. Something happens, especially emotional. I start to talk out loud. That's how I process things. And so this man does that. It says, Jesus says in the parable, the man was wealthy, and he had a good crop. So good that he couldn't even store it in his granary. So he says to himself out loud, he says, "Oh my God, what am I going to do? I got all this grain. I know what I'll do. I'll knock down my granary, level it, build a new one so I can put all this in here and keep it for myself." Now, he could have said, "Wow, I've got all this extra grain. I've got a lot of poor neighbors. I think I'm going to help other people." All about him. I've got to keep it all for myself. I'm going to be greedy. But then he goes on. Now, if he stopped there, his conversation, but he even has a conversation about the future. And he says, "This is what I'll say to myself in the future." So he says, I'll build this billiard grain, and then after I build it and have all this stuff for myself, then I'll say out loud to myself, "Eat, drink, be merry." And then God says, "You fool, this very night you're going to die." What are you going to do with all that wealth? Can't take it with you. The scripture today asks us that question. And again, it's not just about giving something away. It's about realizing deep in the spirit what greed can do to us and what the opposite of that is. When we live for ourselves only, think only of ourselves, only want for ourselves, and forget about anyone else around us, sometimes even family. Some of the worst fights in family are after the death of a parent, and it's about money. And some of the most lasting divisions in family happen over the inheritance. I've seen it all the time. It's ugly. I was thinking this week, as I had read these scriptures several times, about the musical Oliver. And I don't have all the details down, but it's kind of complex, I guess. Oliver, the poor boy, I guess he's an orphan. He's out on the streets, he's stealing things. So the mafia of their day in England comes along and gets him and enlists him in this group of other young people who their job was now to go pickpocket people, bring the stuff back to the mafia of their day, and they took care of him. They fed him, and they had a place to sleep. So in this scene, Oliver's been doing this, and he's sitting down at the table, and they've all had their porridge, and they're eating, and he's still hungry. So he goes up to the table where the mafia leaders or whatever are serving the porridge. He says, in the best of his Old English, "Can I have some more porridge?" And everybody turns, because you never asked for more. And the mafia people said, "More? You want more porridge?" It wasn't because he was greedy, it's because he was hungry. He wanted some more. And that was not to be heard. What would we do if we had plenty and somebody over here said, "Can I have a little? I'm hungry." And let's face it, today, in this day and age, we face this every week, if not every day. Every single day, we could find somebody to be generous with, even give a buck to, that would get more out of that buck than we ever could. So Jesus would ask us, what do you do? What's happening in your spirit? What do you see with the eyes of your spirit? Or do you only see yourself, what you want and what you need? My first time as a pastor, I went to South Central. It was the poorest parish I was ever in. All black and Latino. There were 3 whites. I was one of them. And there were very poor people there. And often I would bump into families that, they'd say, "Well, we have meat once a week or maybe twice, maybe some chicken, but we don't have meat very often." It was mostly frijoles and rice. That's it. And tortillas. But boy, could they be generous with those. And they'd say things like this: "Well, we don't have any meat or chicken tonight, but we have some frijole and beans if you want to come over. I mean, frijole and arroz. Come on over. We'll share with you what we have." I find that poor people often, not always, are very, very generous. Many very generous rich people too. Very generous people. But all of us have a tendency, perhaps, it's that condition of sin, to pull us toward greed, to only taking care of ourselves. And Jesus says, real richness isn't in the things that we possess, it's the things that are a part of our spirit. And when we find ourselves rich in generosity, rich in love, rich in a desire to serve, rich in a desire to give, that's when we discover real life. So we have a choice. Choose a life of greed, thinking only of self, or discovering deep in our spirit that being generous in all kinds of ways, with time, with money, with our energy, from that richness comes new life.